Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest gaming and chatting video. So I thought I would dust off this series here to actually reintroduce it and do it in a method that I've been doing with some of my other playlists, and that's featuring a very fascinating book to talk about through multiple chapters and ultimately multiple parts for this playlist. The reason why I found this book here that I'm going to talk about in just a moment was because originally I was trying to find something that'll feature Silent Hill. And lo and behold, there at the archive.org website, I found this book that talks about horror video games. Very fascinating stuff. Once I saw that information and I was looking through the chapters, I saw that it was indeed talking about Silent Hill, but it talks about multiple other famous games that I've chronicled here within my playlist. There's Silent Hill. There's also The Suffering. Somebody was making a comment earlier as well. Why don't I talk about Resident Evil as well? And so this particular book does feature it, and it features essays from people who were either directly involved with the games or they actually work towards the games in some manner, even loosely. And so it's a great way to talk about these type of video games that are very popular. I love them. You guys and gals love them as well. And then I'll give my own thoughts and opinions on them too. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and start the book here. Horror Video Games, Essays on the Fusion of Fear and Play. It's a book that came out about 15 years ago. And then again, I'll give my thoughts. I'd love to hear what your own thoughts are as well. Now, the introduction does have multiple parts. There's several people that have created their own type of forewords. I'm going to skip one of them. That's actually, interestingly, from Clive Barker. It's all right. Like, when I read it, it was weird and it was a little more X-rated. So I don't want to get on the bad side of YouTube. So I'm going to skip it. But if you want to read his entry, check out the link below. But the next one is titled Introduction, Gaming After Dark by Bernard Perron, who is actually the editor associated with this book. There's no one single author. There's, again, multiple essays that are being done by multiple people, and his just happens to be first. So his first segment, it says evaluating actual resources. So here's what he says. From the graphic novel to the stories of Edgar Allan Poe, Howard P. Lovecraft, Clive Barker, and Stephen King, from the Hammer movies to the gore or slasher craze, horror literature and cinema have always elicited a strong interest in the academic community, surprisingly so considering their popular status. On the one hand, this can be explained by the simple fact that fear, as Lovecraft rightfully underlines, is the oldest and strongest emotion experienced by humans. What's more, as the ethologist Irenaeus Abel Ebosfeld notes, perhaps man is one of the most fearful creatures, since added to the basic fear of predators and, above all, should we say nowadays, hostile specifics, come intellectually based existential fears. By exteriorizing doubts and anguish of death, the body, the other, transgression, etc., the horror genre helps us to understand and express these feelings. On the other hand, the genre is associated with well-known and easily recognized conventions. Acknowledging more or less flexible rules, the reader/viewer is playing at frightening himself. The mediation of horror has always supposed to be an important ludic dimension. While this description suits horror video games perfectly, no book has thus far been dedicated to the phenomenon. Yet, as Mark Hills asserts in the introduction of The Pleasures of Horror, video games go beyond the critical hegemony of horror equals films and novels. Academic interest regarding video games has been constantly rising since 2000. Books with a broad and general theoretical approach of the phenomenon are now many. They include The Medium of the Video Game, 2001, The Video Game Theory 1 and 2, Rules of Play, Game Design Fundamentals, Half Real, video games between real rules and fictional worlds, Tomb Raiders and Space Invaders, video games forms and context, Introduction to Game Studies, games in cultures, and those are just to name a few. But as Rune Clervger points out in the hardcore column for the Digital Games Research Association, there is a gap in our field between general theory and analysis of particular games. There are surprisingly few that direct their attention at the level of genre. This genre blindness is visible insofar as English books on video games studying a generic body of work who are, to my knowledge, almost inexistent except maybe for massively multiplayer online role-playing games with titles like Massively Multiplayer Online Role-Playing Games, The People, The Addiction, and The Playing Experience, or the more focused Digital Culture, Play and Identity, a World of Warcraft reader. Apart from two Italian publications, Francesco Zalinovi's Resident Evil in 2004 and Bernard Parton's Silent Hill in 2006, no study deals entirely with the horror genre in the video game. The few scholarly incursions into that world are to be found in conference proceedings, academic journals, and various collections of essays. This is, among others, the case of Evil Will Walk Once More, Phantasmagoria, the Stalker film as interactive movie, Hands-on Horror by Tanya Kriswanki, Proliferation Horror, Survival Horror, and the Resident Evil franchise by Richard J. Hand, Sign of a Threat, The Effect of Warning Systems in Survival Horror Games by Bernard Perron, Playing with Ourselves, a psychoanalytic investigation of Resident Evil and Silent Hill by Mark C. Hentos and Sarah E. White, and The Self-Reflexive Funhouse of Silent Hill by Evan Kirkland. To address in length the issue of fear and terror and horror in fiction, it is necessary to look in the direction of literature and cinema. One has to look into account past seminal contributions like Todorov's The Fantastic, a structural approach to a literal genre, Julia Kristeva's Powers of Horror, Carroll's The Philosophy of Horror or Paradoxes of the Heart, and anthologies like Barry B. Grant's Planks of Reason and Ken Gilder's The Horror Reader. However, the many books published in the last few years leave no doubt about the academic vigor surrounding the study of horror. Besides, the genre is growing in popularity. According to Mort Castle, in 1997, the horror field was emerging from a decade-long slump/disappearance. Today, horror is commercially viable again, with horror imprint to be found at most major publishers of fiction, and horror a virtual sure sell for youth-oriented films, television programs, and video games. When one knows that the average gamer is now 33 years old, according to Entertainment Software Association, and that many undergraduates and graduates are now studying games in hundreds of academic programs that include video, computer, digital games in their titles, and one realizes the validity and necessity of initiating the story of horror in the videolic field of research. The next segment is a short historical cutscene. The horror genre emerges relatively early in the history of the video game with the famous Haunted House, which came out in Atari 1981. Of course, the available resources were very limited at the beginning of the 80s. To attract the potential gamer, the horrifying content was mainly evoked by the information on the box. With its 4 kilobyte ROM-based game cartridge, comparatively to the gigabytes of the contemporary home console video games, both on DVD and Blu-ray, the game's capacity to propose a horrifying experience obviously seemed negligible. The forms were already a little clearer in the 1985 action game Chiller. Ironically, a text adventure game, i.e., that is almost exclusively generated from writing, will mostly mark this decade, which is the Lurking Horror Infocom 1987. Very quickly, the horror video game attempted to measure itself against literary and film canons. Slashers like John Carpenter's Halloween and Sean Cunningham's Friday the 13th were adapted. Project Firestar borrowed generously from the films Alien and Aliens. The games presented the creatures and other horrifying elements through shot cutscenes skillfully integrated into the gamer's playing time. Several third-person graphic adventure games, some with more detailed but static pictures, related themselves to the horror. One may recall, among others, The Call of Cthulhu, Shadow of the Comet, which came out from Infogames 1993, inspired by the myth created by H.P. Lovecraft. In this line, it was Alone in the Dark, 1992, that obtained the greatest notoriety. The Infogrames game simulated the variety of typical filmic shots and exploited the off-screen space so as to create effects of surprise. Alone in the Dark equally obtained its fame because it was associated with the birth of a specific horror video game genre, the survival horror. That is horror-based third-person action-adventure games. The game set up several of the generic conventions: inventory, limitations in ammo and health, maze-like world, etc., of a genre series like Resident Evil and Silent Hill, which later became very popular. Indeed, the first games of these series are true video game classics, using all the audiovisual tricks of horror film, camera angles and movements, lighting, deadly silences, eerie music, scary monsters, etc., and showing a wide spectrum of effects, from horror to terror, and from the visceral to the psychological. Online specialized databases, such as those of All Game Guide, Moby Games, or the ones on websites covering and reviewing games like GameSpot, although not as exhaustive and precise as one might wish, refer to hundreds of horror video games and denote how much the horror has taken root in the video game. And then the next segment is called Looking at the Horror. Given that a great majority of video games are based on the need to stay alive in front of mushrooms, soldiers, gangsters, cars, spaceships, etc., survival horror might be the video game genre par excellence, since it brings out this notion of survival and converts our fear of threats into dreadful monsters. Other reasons also allow this statement, see Perron 2006. However, one should not limit the videoludic horror to the sole survival horror genre. The question of genre isn't answered anymore with an exclusive approach. Sets of common elements, such as attitudes, characters, places, aesthetic traits, etc., and sequences of events serve as constraints for both the production and the reception of an artwork. Genres certainly frame the way a novel, a film, or a game is to be understood. Since genre boundaries have become more and more blurred, alternative questions like those of Tom Ryle are required. What genre or genres constitute an effective and pertinent context for the reading of this game or film? Or what are the world or worlds invoked by the aspects of this game or film which will enable it to be situated and understood, its narrative trajectory anticipated, its characters to be constructed, and so on. We can also ask, what are the most effective effects aimed by the games or the films? In that perspective, horror games are mainly intended to scare the gamers. They are borrowing the expression from Isabel Pinedo, a bounded experience of fear. And let's go ahead, I'm going to pause it here then, and then that way it'll stop part 1 of chapter 1 of this book here that's titled Horror Video Games, Essays on the Fusion of Fear and Play. I'm sorry, not chapter 1, more of an introduction by Bernard Perron. He's going to continue for just a little bit, and then I'll be able to wrap up afterward. But otherwise, as you can see, this is essentially what the book will be about. It's going to showcase essays, very detailed essays with lots of citations for them involving the person talking about a specific theme. In this case, it's Bernard Perron going over his information about these video games, how they started, how basically it started in the early 1980s. It looks like he cited Haunted House as the Atari 1981 thing that started it all, and then how others eventually broadened out, especially when it came to movies. And it's like Halloween and then Friday the 13th. I'm surprised he didn't mention The Nightmare on Elm Street, which is another popular game that came out and definitely took on a world of its own, especially on the NES. But yeah, otherwise it gives you an idea essentially of what this book will be about. I cannot wait until it starts talking about Silent Hill in more detail, and then also Resident Evil as well. And then some of the people, again, will be directly involved with those games. They're going to be giving their own essays as well. But let me know what you guys think. Do you want more of this? Post it in the comments. I'll be able to see what part 2 will be when it comes to next time. and then based on the reception, and then I'll go from there. All right, everybody. Thanks again as always. Take care. Bye.